Across multiple cases, he observed patients, especially empaths, who seemed gentle and broken until something inside them snapped. What I call the awakened ones, individuals who embodied Jung's concepts of shadow integration, changed not just their own lives, but revolutionized how we understand human psychology. Jung spent decades studying what mirrored the principles of shadow work in empathic individuals. Here's what he discovered that terrifies psychologists to this day. The kindest people aren't weak. They're weapons waiting to be forged. Jung's case files from his Zurich clinic reveal a disturbing pattern. Patient after patient arrived carrying the same wounds, empaths who had been systematically destroyed by those who claimed to love them. They came with bruises they explained away, depression they blamed on themselves, and a universal tendency to apologize for existing. Jung documented what he saw across dozens of these cases. These individuals had spent their lives absorbing everyone else's pain. Alcoholic parents' rage, spouses' infidelity, family members' dysfunction. They were what I call the emotional shock absorbers of their social systems. Individuals who exemplified Jung's observations about how sensitive people often become repositories for collective psychological pain. Here's the part that made Jung's blood run cold. These empaths didn't just endure abuse, they systematized it. When Jung asked them to describe their relationships, he expected the scattered thoughts of damaged minds. What he discovered changed everything he thought he knew about empaths. These patients hadn't been broken by abuse. They had been studying it. Jung found that empaths kept detailed mental records of every person who had ever hurt them. They knew their abusers' triggers, insecurities, and deepest fears. They had mapped emotional patterns with surgical precision. They had never used this knowledge, not once, until something pushed them past their breaking point. Jung wrote about how the empath's mind operates not as a victim's diary, but as what I would call a strategist's war room, waiting for the moment of activation. If you've ever felt like people underestimate your awareness, write this in the comments. I see everything. Jung realized he wasn't treating victims. He was sitting across from what I call psychological geniuses in hiding. Individuals whose capabilities reflected Jung's theories about the advanced psychological functions some people develop. These empaths' genius wasn't in creation, it was in emotional archaeology. They could excavate people's deepest wounds just by watching their micro-expressions. Jung began testing their abilities. He brought in colleagues without telling these patients anything about them. Within minutes, they could identify childhood traumas, relationship patterns, professional insecurities. Their accuracy rate was consistently above 95%. Here's what made Jung's hands shake as he wrote his notes. These empaths weren't psychic. They were simply paying attention at a level most humans never reach. What others call intuition, they called data collection. Jung started to understand something revolutionary about empaths. They don't just feel more deeply, they process emotional information faster and more accurately than anyone else. Their brains are wired for pattern recognition in human behavior. Society had taught these individuals that this gift was a curse. Every time they tried to voice what they saw, the lies, the manipulation, the hidden agendas, people called them too sensitive or overly emotional. They learned to silence themselves, to doubt their perceptions, to apologize for seeing what others couldn't. The truth doesn't disappear just because you stop speaking it. It accumulates. And in these cases, it had been accumulating for decades. Jung observed how empaths don't lose their mind from feeling too much. They lose their mind from being told their feelings are wrong. He realized these patients weren't having nervous breakdowns. They were having breakthroughs. Jung identified a consistent pattern across his empath cases. Their transformation didn't happen gradually. It happened in one explosive moment that reflected what Jung understood about shadow integration under extreme duress. The trigger was always betrayal, not just any betrayal, but betrayal by someone the empath had completely trusted and protected. In case after case, Jung documented the same scenario. The empath would discover infidelity, financial betrayal, or emotional manipulation from their closest person. What made it devastating wasn't the act itself. It was the realization that they had seen the signs all along and ignored them. These patients did what empaths do. They said nothing. They absorbed the pain in silence. They blamed themselves. They tried harder to be perfect partners, children, or friends. Then came the moment that changed everything. What I call the clarity event, When the empath's pattern recognition finally overwhelmed their need to believe the best in people, embodied Jung's concepts about psychological awakening. Most people would expect empaths to cry, to scream, to fall apart. Their abusers expected that too. They were prepared for emotional chaos. What happened instead was something that terrified everyone involved. The empaths became unnaturally calm. Jung documented this as the moment when someone finally integrates their analytical capabilities with their emotional intelligence. Jung observed across multiple cases what I would describe as the most chilling psychological transformation possible. These empaths didn't attack. They didn't rage. They simply began to speak truth. They revealed everything they had observed, catalogued, and silently endured. Not with cruelty, with clinical precision, like surgeons identifying each diseased organ before removing it. This wasn't revenge, it was clarity. These empaths were finally using their gift of complete perception, not to excuse behavior, but to expose it. Jung's observations echoed the ancient wisdom that there is no fury like someone who has finally learned to trust their own perceptions. Jung realized this pattern across his cases wasn't revenge. This was what he termed shadow integration, the moment when someone stops denying the parts of themselves they were taught to hide. The empath's shadow wasn't evil. It was their suppressed intelligence, their silenced intuition, their denied strength. When they finally integrated these aspects of themselves, they became what Jung called psychologically complete. Here's what made these cases so disturbing for Jung. The transformation was permanent. These patients didn't cycle back into people-pleasing. They didn't apologize for their newfound boundaries. They didn't second-guess their perceptions anymore. They had become what Jung feared most, empaths who could no longer be manipulated. The changes didn't stop at the psychological level. Jung documented how these individuals' entire lives transformed within months. They left abusive relationships with strategic precision. They cut contact with toxic family members without emotional drama. They rebuilt their lives on their own terms. Jung observed them becoming what he called selectively empathetic, still deeply caring, but strategically protective of where that care flowed. The most disturbing part for Jung was how these transformed empaths' presence affected others. People who had once walked all over them suddenly felt nervous around them. They couldn't explain why. These empaths weren't aggressive or cruel, but everyone sensed something had fundamentally changed. Jung identified what he called the predator's instinct. Manipulative people can sense when their usual tactics won't work. They avoid integrated empaths like vampires avoid sunlight. Jung wrote, "The awakened empath doesn't need to announce their power. Others can feel it in their bones. Comment if people started treating you differently when you found your backbone. They sensed the change before I announced it." Jung's fascination with these empath cases went beyond professional interest. He was disturbed because he recognized something in their transformation, something that mirrored his own psychological development. Jung himself was what we would now call a highly sensitive person. He understood the empath's journey from the inside. He knew the pain of seeing what others couldn't see, feeling what others wouldn't feel. These cases forced him to confront a disturbing question. What happens when empaths stop being society's emotional shock absorbers and start using their gifts strategically? Jung spent years following these transformed patients' post-integration lives. What he discovered kept him awake at night. These individuals had become extraordinarily successful. Their businesses thrived because they could read clients' real needs before they voiced them. Their new relationships were healthy because they could identify emotional predators within minutes. Their decisions were flawless because they trusted their intuitive intelligence completely. Jung realized something that made his blood run cold. These empaths hadn't become less empathetic. They had become perfectly empathetic, which meant they were also perfectly strategic. They could manipulate others as easily as they had once been manipulated. They understood human psychology at a level that made them nearly omnipotent in social situations. Here's what truly terrified Jung. These transformed empaths chose not to use this power destructively. They could have destroyed every person who had ever hurt them. Instead, they simply removed toxic people from their lives and moved on. Jung realized he had witnessed the birth of what he called the integrated empath, someone with both the sensitivity to feel everything and the wisdom to choose what deserved their energy. Jung's private notes reveal his amazement. "I have observed something beautiful and terrible. These individuals have become what every manipulator fears most, someone who can see through them completely, but no longer needs anything from them. If you've reached the point where you can read people, but no longer need their approval, right, I see you, but I don't need you." These empath transformations didn't happen in isolation. Jung documented how their changes affected every system they had been part of. Family dynamics collapsed, not because these individuals destroyed them, but because they stopped enabling dysfunction. Alcoholic family members were forced to face their addictions without empaths as emotional dumping grounds. Depressed relatives had to find other sources of validation. Manipulative siblings could no longer use these transformed empaths as psychological punching bags. Here's what made Jung realize how powerful awakened empaths truly are. Their transformation forced everyone around them to evolve or reveal their true nature. The healthy people in their lives grew stronger from their example. The toxic people exposed themselves through desperate attempts to pull these empaths back into old patterns. Jung observed something that reflects what I call the empath's mirror effect. These transformed individuals didn't have to actively confront people's dysfunction anymore. Their mere presence reflected issues back with uncomfortable clarity. Manipulators couldn't stand to be around them. They felt exposed, seen through, unable to operate their usual psychological games. Meanwhile, authentic people felt safe with these empaths for the first time. Jung's research showed that awakened empaths become living truth detectors, not through judgment, but through presence. The most disturbing discovery came when Jung introduced these transformed patients to others in his practice. Within minutes, they could identify core psychological wounds and the exact type of therapy needed. Jung realized these empaths' diagnostic accuracy surpassed his own decades of training. This created an ethical dilemma that haunted him for years. If empaths could develop this level of psychological insight, what did that mean for the future of psychology itself? He began quietly studying other empaths in his practice, developing what I call the Integration Observation Protocol, a framework for understanding how this transformation occurs naturally. Jung's integration observation framework wasn't therapy in the traditional sense. It was psychological documentation of how empaths naturally developed what I call warrior consciousness after severe betrayal. Jung identified consistent stages across his cases. The first stage, recognition. Empaths learn to identify their suppressed shadow aspects, not just their anger, but their intelligence, their strength, their right to boundaries. These individuals stopped pathologizing their perceptions and started trusting their emotional intelligence as the sophisticated data processing system it actually was. The second stage proved more intense, integration. Jung watched empaths merge their light and shadow aspects into what he authentically termed the complete self. They became people who could be incredibly kind to those who deserved it and ruthlessly precise with those who didn't. The third stage, application, was what Jung found most fascinating. Integrated empaths learned to use their emotional intelligence strategically, not just defensively. They became what I describe as psychological architects, people who could read, influence, and navigate human systems with supernatural precision. Jung realized these transformed empaths could no longer be victimized because they saw manipulation coming from miles away and neutralized it before it could take root. These individuals didn't just heal themselves, they became immune to psychological abuse while maintaining their capacity for genuine love and connection. Jung's private notes reveal his amazement. "I have observed the development of compassion paired with wisdom. These individuals are now among the most psychologically powerful people I have ever encountered." The process's final stage was what Jung understood as the natural return to service. Integrated empaths didn't become cold or disconnected. They became selectively generous with their gifts. They used their abilities to help other empaths transform, creating what Jung documented as a network of psychologically resilient individuals. Jung's work with these empath cases created ripple effects that continue to this day. He realized that empaths weren't mentally ill. They were evolutionarily advanced individuals living in systems designed to exploit their gifts. Jung began seeing empathic sensitivity not as a disorder to be cured, but as a psychological capability to be properly understood and protected. He also recognized something concerning. In the wrong circumstances, these abilities could be devastating. An empath who integrated their shadow without proper ethical grounding could become extremely manipulative. Jung developed what I call the ethical integration model, documenting how awakened empaths naturally used their powers for healing rather than harm. His case files on these transformations remained among his most closely guarded research. He knew that if the wrong people learned how to deliberately trigger empath transformation, it could be weaponized. Jung scattered his observations across multiple private journals, never publishing the complete findings during his lifetime. Pathetic, but perfectly empathetic. Jung left one final insight for future psychologists. Never underestimate someone who has learned to trust their own perceptions completely. The awakened empath represents psychology's most powerful evolution. Comment if you've learned to trust your intuition completely. I no longer doubt what I see and feel. Jung's observations about awakened empaths proved prophetic in ways even he couldn't have imagined. Modern research confirms what his cases demonstrated. Empaths who undergo shadow integration become psychologically invincible. They can no longer be gaslighted because they trust their perceptions absolutely. They can't be manipulated because they see emotional games before they're fully formed. They can't be broken because they've already been to the bottom and emerged stronger. Here's what makes Jung's case studies eternally relevant. Every empath will face their transformation moment. The betrayal so profound, it forces them to choose between remaining a victim or becoming sovereign. The question isn't whether the empath will snap. It's whether they'll integrate their shadow consciously, like Jung's documented cases, or let it consume them destructively. Jung's research revealed that most empaths, when pushed to their breaking point, choose integration. They don't become cruel, they become precise. They don't lose their hearts, they gain backbones. The transformed empath becomes what Jung called love with boundaries, someone who can care deeply while protecting themselves absolutely. Jung's final insight about these cases still resonates through psychology circles today. These individuals didn't become different people. They became who they always were beneath the conditioning. Every empath carries within them the potential to become psychologically untouchable. It just takes the right catalyst, usually betrayal, to force that transformation. Jung wrote, "The empath's greatest tragedy isn't their sensitivity, it's how long they wait to honor it properly." Remember where we started. Jung's documentation of a psychological pattern so disturbing, he called it the most terrifying transformation in human nature. These weren't isolated cases. They represented a fundamental truth about empathic psychology. Jung's research revealed something that still makes psychologists uncomfortable. Empaths aren't naturally victims. They're naturally powerful. Society just teaches them to suppress that power in the name of being acceptable. When empaths finally snap, they're not breaking. They're awakening to abilities they possessed all along. Jung's case files reveal the truth that manipulators don't want you to know. The kindest people are often the strongest people, because kindness without strength enables dysfunction. The awakened empaths Jung documented represent evolution in action, individuals who can feel everything and choose everything with complete consciousness. Jung spent decades studying patients who seemed gentle and broken until something inside them snapped. His research proved that the empath's journey isn't about becoming less sensitive. It's about becoming consciously sensitive. And consciousness, Jung realized, is what transforms victims into forces of nature. The most beautiful part of Jung's findings? These transformed empaths never lost their capacity for love. They just learned to love themselves as fiercely as they once loved others. If you're an empath reading this, remember Jung's essential discovery. Your sensitivity isn't your weakness, it's your weapon. And the day you learn to wield it consciously is the day you become truly powerful, not dangerous to innocent people, dangerous to those who would exploit your gifts. That's exactly what the world needs more of. Empaths who know their worth, trust their perceptions, and refuse to dim their light for anyone's comfort. Jung's research left us with this question: not whether empaths will transform, but whether they'll do it consciously or let life force it upon them. Comment below. I choose conscious transformation